There are mornings that change the direction of an entire life. Not with thunder, not with a great wind or a flood or a fire that eats the ridge, but with 4 lines of pencil on a scrap of brown paper, pinned to the inside of a cabin door with a harness needle. Lorena Sable read those 4 lines twice before she let herself sit down on the split log step outside the door. The words were simple. They were written in the careful, slanting hand of a man who had taken his time, which meant he had been awake for hours before he wrote them, which meant he had sat in the dark of that cabin and listened to her breathe and decided to leave anyway. The note said, "I cannot do this. The grove is dead. The bank will be here Thursday. I am sorry, Rena." It was not signed because it did not need to be. Her husband Harlan had ridden out sometime before dawn on the gray mare, and the gray mare was the only thing of value he had taken with him. He had left behind the milk cow named Bess, and 6 laying hens, and 43 acres of central Texas hill country, and a woman he had married when the pecan trees were still bearing, and the future still looked like something worth riding toward. Rena was 23 years old. She had a sun-warmed face with a scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Dark auburn hair she wore in a single thick braid down her back, and gray-blue eyes that had not yet learned to narrow against the world. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, and she weighed 118 pounds, and she was standing alone on a patch of cracked earth in Llano County, Texas, with 190 dead pecan trees and a note. It was a Sunday in the 2nd week of October, 1891. She sat on that step for a long time. The morning light moved across the yard and touched the fence posts and climbed the trunks of the nearest dead trees, and she watched it move without seeing it, her mind blank, her hands still. The morning happening around her like something meant for someone else. The air smelled like dry cedar and limestone dust, and the faint bitterness of dead leaves that had fallen months ago and never been raked. A mockingbird was singing somewhere behind the cabin, which struck her as unreasonable. The world should have had the decency to be quiet. She thought about the 2 good years. She and Harlan had bought the orchard 3 years earlier from a widow named Mrs. Callister, who was moving back to Tennessee because her children were there and her husband was buried there, and she said the hill country was no place for a woman with her memories. They had paid $400 for the land and the trees and the cabin, and for 2 seasons the pecans had carried more nuts than 2 people could shake down in a week. Rena remembered the sound of them falling, the soft, rapid drumming of shells hitting the canvas sheets they spread beneath the branches. She remembered Harlan laughing under the biggest tree, with his hat full of pecans and his face full of the particular kind of joy that comes from being young and married and standing in the middle of something that is working. Then the drought had come. It came in the summer of 1890, and it did not leave. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property cracked at its bottom like a broken plate. The hills of Llano County turned the color of old bone. The grass died first, then the wildflowers, then the smaller trees along the fence line, and then, one by one, the pecans stopped bearing. Their leaves curled and browned and fell. Their branches went bare. And Harlan had started looking at the sky with a stillness behind his eyes that frightened her more than any words he could have spoken. The look of a man who has stopped asking questions because he already knows the answer. But the good years were not the only thing she carried. There was also the mistake. When the drought first began, a family named Dawes, who lived 3 miles to the north, had ridden down to offer them water from their deep well. The Dawes family had drilled that well 40 feet into the limestone, and it had never gone dry, not even in the worst summers, and old Mr. Dawes had stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said they were welcome to haul as many barrels as they needed. No charge, no obligation, just neighbors helping neighbors the way it was supposed to be done. And Rena had said no. She had thanked him, and she had said no. She had said it with a smile, and she had said they would be fine. And she had said it because she was 21 years old and proud, and because accepting help from a neighbor felt like admitting that she and Harlan could not manage on their own. She had said no because she believed that self-sufficiency was the same thing as strength, and she did not yet understand that sometimes they are opposites. By the time she realized she needed that water, the Dawes family had sold their land and moved to Fredericksburg. The well was still there. The offer was not. She carried that refusal inside her chest like a stone. She carried it now, sitting on the step with the note in her hand. She had let pride make a decision that time should have made, and the trees had paid for it, and now Harlan had paid for it, and now she was paying for it, and the payment was not finished. The bank in Brecker was holding a note for $412 that came due on Thursday. The note had been written on a Sunday. That gave her 4 days. Rena had $14 in a tin box under the bed, and a milk cow, and 6 laying hens, and no plan. She stood up from the step sometime close to noon. Not because she had decided anything, not because hope had arrived or clarity had descended, or some voice in her head had told her what to do. She stood up because sitting still on that step was going to kill her faster than walking. And if she was going to die, she preferred to die in motion. She walked out to the grove first. The dead trees stood in rows that Harlan had kept clean and straight, and even in death they held their shape. The limbs were bare and gray and brittle, but the trunks were still standing true, and the bark had not yet begun to slough. She put her hand on the nearest trunk and felt the dry heat coming off the southern side where the sun had been beating since dawn. The wood beneath the bark was still hard, still dense, still something, even if she did not know what. 190 trees, 43 acres, every one of them dead or dying. She walked back to the cabin and put the $14 in her dress pocket and put the note in her other pocket and started walking toward Brecker. It was 6 miles on the wagon road that followed the creek bed south and then turned east along the base of the ridge. The road was dry, and the dust rose with every step and settled on her boots and on the hem of her dress, and she did not care. She walked with her braids swinging against her back, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and her mouth set in a line that was not determination and was not despair, but was something between the two that did not have a name. She arrived in Brecker in the middle of the afternoon. It was a small town, the kind that existed because 2 roads crossed, and a man had once built a store at the crossing, and other men had built things near the store, and eventually someone had put up a sign. There was a bank and a livery stable, and a feed store, and a blacksmith shop, and, on the north side of the plaza, where the old live oaks gave shade, a dry goods store with a painted sign that said Cask General Merchandise, in letters that had once been green and were now the color of sage. She did not know why she walked into that store instead of the bank. She would think about that for the rest of her life, and she would never arrive at a satisfying answer. Maybe it was because the bank felt like an ending, and the store felt like a middle. Maybe it was because the door was open and she could see light inside. Maybe it was because she was thirsty and hoped someone would offer her water. Whatever the reason, she walked through that door and into a room that smelled like flour and coffee and lamp oil and dried tobacco, and her life divided itself into before and after like a pecan log splits along the grain. The woman behind the counter was broad-shouldered and tall, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back tight and pinned, and she wore a dove-gray dress with a starched white collar that looked like it had been ironed that morning, which it had. She was weighing flour on a brass scale when Rena walked in, and she looked up and took Rena in with one clean look that started at her boots and moved to her face and stopped at her eyes and stayed there. She saw the dust. She saw the note folded in the hand. She saw the unsteadiness around the mouth. And she saw something else, something that only a woman who has stood in that exact same place can see in another woman standing in it now. Her name was Ottilie Kask. She was 53 years old. Her late husband, as the town understood it, had been a blacksmith from Fredericksburg, a German immigrant who had died of fever 8 years ago. She ran the store alone because her son was in the territory with the Rangers, and her daughter had married a Methodist preacher in Austin, and neither of them came home often enough to suit her. She had a reputation in Brecker for being fair in her prices and sharp in her opinions and generous in ways she preferred people not to talk about. She looked at Rena for 3 full seconds, which does not sound like a long time, but is an eternity when you are standing in a strange store with dust on your boots and a note in your hand and your life in pieces on the floor around you. Then Ottilie said, "Sit down, child. Let me get you a cup of coffee." She poured the coffee from a blue enamel pot that she kept on a small stove behind the counter. She put 3 spoonfuls of sugar in it and a splash of cream from a jar she kept in a cool box near the floor. She did not ask how Rena took her coffee. She simply made it the way a person needs coffee made when they have walked 6 miles in the dust with a note in their pocket. Sweet and rich and warm. Rena sat on the stool by the counter and drank. The coffee went into her like medicine. She felt it in her chest and in her hands and behind her eyes, and she understood something about Ottilie Kask in that moment that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A woman who pays attention to a stranger's coffee is a woman who pays attention to everything. She set the cup down and took the note from her pocket and unfolded it and laid it on the counter between them. Ottilie picked it up and read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it along the same crease and handed it back across the counter with both hands, the way a person hands back a letter that matters. There was a silence. Then Ottilie spoke. "Harlan Sable rode through this plaza at 4 o'clock this morning. I saw him from my bedroom window. I sleep light, and I have for 16 years. And when a horse goes through the plaza at 4 in the morning, I get up and look. He was riding the gray mare, and he was heading south, and he did not look back once. Not once, child. That is a man who is gone." Rena felt the words land in her chest one after another, each one heavy, each one sinking, each one sending out its own ring of pain. She did not cry. She had already cried, sometime between reading the note and standing up from the step, a brief, hard crying that had come and gone like a summer squall, and left her feeling hollowed out and strangely steady. "But a dead pecan grove," Ottilie said, leaning forward slightly and lowering her voice, "is not the same thing as a dead woman. Those trees are still standing. And standing pecan wood is worth more than you think." "Standing pecan wood," Rena repeated. She did not know what it meant, but she said the words carefully, slowly, the way you repeat a phrase in a language you are just beginning to learn. Because Ottilie Kask had said them as if they were a particular kind of key, the kind that opens a door you did not know was there. "Standing pecan wood," Ottilie said again, and then she smiled for the first time since Rena had walked in. It was not a large smile. It was thin and knowing, and it carried the weight of something Rena did not yet understand. "Child, there are men in this county who would walk 30 miles on foot for a single acre of dry standing pecan. What your husband looked at and saw a graveyard, another kind of man will look at and see a lumber yard that has already done half its own work." Rena stared at her. Ottilie leaned closer across the counter. "And there happens to be one of those men standing 10 feet behind you right now," she said, pretending to count nails. Rena turned around. The man at the nail barrel was long and lean, with iron-gray hair under a pale straw hat, deep-set brown eyes, and hands that were large and scarred, and had done careful work for more than 40 years. He was standing very still with a handful of nails that he was clearly not counting. And when Rena turned to look at him, he met her eyes with the expression of a man who has been caught listening and is not particularly sorry about it. His name was Judson Fennick. He was 63 years old. He had been a cooper and barrel maker in Gonzales for most of his working life, building whiskey barrels and wine casks and water tanks and anything else that required wood to be bent and shaped and joined with precision. His lungs had started giving him trouble 7 years ago, the wet, heavy cough that comes from breathing sawdust for 4 decades, and a doctor in San Antonio had told him to move up into the dry hill country air or prepare to be buried in the wet lowland kind. He had moved to Llano County, and he had improved, and he had spent the last 7 years doing small work with his hands and waiting for something that felt like purpose. He took off his hat and crossed the room and said, without introducing himself first, "Pecan is the finest furniture wood in Texas. I heard what you said about the grove. I would like to come see it tomorrow morning, if you will have me." Rena looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent his life making things. She looked at his eyes, which were the eyes of a man who was asking for something and was prepared to be told no. She looked at Ottilie, who was watching them both with that thin smile and saying nothing, and she thought about the Dawes family. She thought about Mr. Dawes standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, offering water, and she thought about the word she had said to him, the word that had cost her more than she could calculate, the word no. She took a breath. Then she said, "Yes." That evening she walked the 6 miles back to the cabin in the late afternoon light. The sun was low over the ridge, and the shadows of the dead pecan trees stretched long and thin across the dry ground, like dark rivers running to nowhere. She walked slowly because her feet were tired, and because she was thinking. She was thinking about pride, about how it had felt like armor when she wore it, and how it felt like a cage now that she could see it from the outside. She was thinking about the Dawes family and their well, and the word she had said, and could not take back. And she was thinking about the word she had said today, the other word, the one that had cost her nothing and might be worth everything. Yes, it was the hardest word she had ever spoken. Not because it was difficult to say, because it required her to admit that she could not do this alone, and admitting that felt like a kind of dying, and she had spent her whole life believing that needing help was the same as being weak. She was beginning to suspect that she had been wrong about that. She reached the cabin at dusk and fed the chickens and milked Bess and ate a cold biscuit standing at the counter and did not light the lamp because the dark felt appropriate. She lay down in the bed she had shared with Harlan and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence where his breathing used to be. And she did not sleep for a long time. But when she did sleep, she slept without dreaming, which was a mercy. Now, before we go on, I want to pause here for just a moment, because I think some of you listening right now know exactly what that step feels like. That split log step. That moment when you are sitting with a piece of paper in your hand and the future you thought you had is gone, and you have to decide whether to sit there or stand up. I want to ask you something. Who was your Ottilie? Who was the person who saw what you needed before you knew you needed it? And did you say yes, or did you say no? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what happens next. Because what happens next is where this story really begins. Judson Fenwick arrived at the grove just after sunrise the next morning in a buckboard pulled by a patient brown mule whose name, Rena would later learn, was Captain. Judd climbed down slowly from the buckboard because of the stiffness in his hips and the tightness in his lungs, and he stood at the edge of the grove and looked at the rows of dead trees, and did not speak. He walked the rows for nearly an hour. He moved slowly, deliberately, stopping at tree after tree to press his palm against the trunk, or to bend a low branch, or to knock on the wood with his knuckles. And listen. The way you listen for an answer you are not certain will come. Rena walked behind him and watched and said nothing, because she understood that he was doing something that required concentration, and she did not want to interrupt it. When he finally stopped, he was standing under the oldest tree at the center of the grove. It was the tallest and the thickest, and it had been the best bearer in the 2 good years. The tree she and Harlan had always shaken first, because its nuts were the biggest and the sweetest. Now it was dead like the rest, its branches bare against the pale October sky, its trunk still straight and true and solid. Judd pressed his palm against the trunk the way a doctor presses a hand against a rib cage. He closed his eyes. He stood like that for a long time, long enough that Rena began to wonder if he had forgotten she was there. Then he opened his eyes, and he said, "This wood is dry standing. That is not a curse, child. That is a blessing. Fresh-cut pecan has to be air-dried for 2 full years before it can be turned into anything worth owning. Your trees have been drying on the stump in the Texas sun for 15 months. They have done the waiting already. These trees are worth more dead than they ever were alive, to a man who knows what to do with them." "I do not know what to do with them," Rena said. "No," Judd said, looking at her steadily, "but I do. And I think Ottilie Kask knows some people who would pay very good money for what I could make out of this wood. If you are willing to work, and you are willing to learn, we can pay your banknote by Thursday, and we can pay it 3 times over by Christmas." "Thursday is in 3 days," Rena said. "Then we had best get started," Judd said. She walked him through every row of the grove after that. She showed him the creek bed where the drought had cracked the clay into pieces the size of dinner plates, and the small limestone outcrop at the north end of the property, where Harlan had once talked about building a second cabin, and the place along the fence line where a hailstorm had knocked down 8 trees in the spring of '90. She showed him the stump of each fallen tree, and the way the roots had torn out of the dry ground, and the way the wood had split along its grain when it hit the earth. Judd listened to all of it without interrupting. He listened with his whole body, tilting his head toward her, his hands resting on the nearest trunk, as if drawing something from the wood while she spoke. And what was behind Rena's words was a woman who knew her land down to its bones and was grieving it the way you grieve a living thing. When they came back to the buckboard, Judd took a stub of pencil from his shirt pocket and drew 3 shapes on the back of an envelope: a chair back, a turned bowl, a long tapered spindle. He handed the envelope to Rena without a word, and she looked at the shapes and understood that she was looking at the future, or at least at the possibility of one, drawn in pencil on the back of an envelope by a man whose hands shook slightly because he was 63, and his lungs were not what they had been, and he had not felt useful in a very long time. Judd drove back to Brecker that afternoon. He returned before dark with 2 things. The first was a rough pencil drawing of a chair, a simple straight-backed dining chair with turned spindles and a shaped seat that he had designed on the drive back to town. The second was Ottilie Kask herself, sitting beside him on the buckboard seat with a canvas bag of ledger books on her lap, and a thin smile that Rena had never seen before. It was the smile of a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and has finally seen it arrive. Ottilie climbed down from the buckboard and looked at the grove in the last of the evening light, and she said only one thing. "Now then, let us see what we have to work with." That night, after Judd had driven back to Brecker, and the dark had come down and the stars had appeared over the ridge the way they always did, thick and bright and indifferent, Rena walked past the door of the small back room where Ottilie had settled in for the night. Ottilie had insisted on staying. She had brought a bedroll, and she had laid it out on the cabin floor near the stove, without asking permission. And Rena had not argued because she had learned, in the span of one afternoon, that arguing with Ottilie Kask was like arguing with weather. She heard something that made her stop. Ottilie was talking. Not to anyone in the room. She was talking to someone who was not there, her voice low and rough and full of something that Rena recognized because she had heard it in her own voice that morning. She knocked softly. Ottilie opened the door. Her eyes were red. On the small table beside her bedroll, there was an old photograph in a wooden frame. A photograph of a man with a heavy mustache and kind eyes, and the thick forearms of a blacksmith. Ottilie did not explain the photograph. She did not explain the talking. She looked at Rena, and she said only this: "I am helping you because I know the room you are standing in. I stood in it 16 years ago, and I will tell you the rest when you are ready to hear it. But not tonight." Then she closed the door gently, and Rena stood in the hallway and understood that Ottilie Kask was carrying something too, something heavy and old and unresolved, and that the help she was offering was not charity. It was something more complicated and more valuable than charity. It was the help of a woman who was trying to repair her own past by rewriting someone else's future. By noon the next day, there were 6 people working in the grove. Judd had sent a rider at dawn to fetch 2 brothers he trusted. Their names were Weston and Arlo Meade, 33 and 28, lean and quiet men who had grown up felling cedar on the edge of the Edwards Plateau and who owed Judd a favor from a year that Rena did not ask about and that no one offered to explain. They arrived on horseback with their tools strapped to their saddles, 2-man crosscut saws and felling axes and iron wedges and a wooden maul. And they dismounted and looked at the grove and looked at each other and went to work without being told where to start. Ottilie had brought her nephew, Talmadge Kask, called Tal, a 19-year-old with shoulders too wide for his shirt, and a gentle stammer that got worse when he was nervous, and better when he was working. Tal could drive a team of oxen better than any grown man in the county, and he had brought with him a pair of red oxen named Drum and Fife that he had trained himself from calves, and that moved at his voice the way a good horse moves at the rein. And a woman named Dorset Anwell, 42 years old, a widow who ran a way station on the mail road 10 miles east of Brecker, had ridden out at mid-morning with 3 loaves of bread and a crock of white beans and a look on her face that suggested she was not planning to leave. She climbed down from her wagon and walked up to Rena and said, "I heard there was a young woman out here alone, and I do not like that sentence." Rena looked at her. Dorset looked back. She was a tall woman with weathered skin and sharp cheekbones, and hands that had done hard work every day of her adult life, and she was not smiling, but she was not unfriendly either. She was simply stating a fact about the world and her relationship to it. "I can cook, and I can haul, and I can hold the other end of a saw," Dorset said, "and I am staying. You can argue about it if you want, but I should warn you, I have never lost an argument in my life, and I do not intend to start today." Rena did not argue. By the end of that first full day of work, they had felled 12 of the dead pecans. The Mead brothers worked with their two-man crosscut saws that sang through the dry wood with a high, thin sound like a fiddle string, and Judd walked behind them calling out which sections of each trunk were turning wood, meant for the lathe, and which were chair stock, straight-grained and strong enough for legs and spindles, and which were suitable only for small boxes and tool handles. He moved among the fallen trees, with his hands on the wood and his eyes half closed, and he read the grain with the slow attention of a man who knows that what is written in wood is more honest than what is written on paper. Rena learned to read the grain of a cut trunk in a single morning. Judd stood behind her with his weathered hand on her shoulder and pointed at the tight curling figure in the heartwood, the swirl of dark and light that pecan wood makes when it has dried slowly and evenly in the open air, and he said, "That is what pays your banknote. That right there. That figure. A furniture maker in Austin would pay $2 a board foot for wood with that figure. And you have got 190 trees full of it." Rena looked at the pattern in the wood, and she felt something shift inside her chest. It was not hope, exactly. It was more like the space where hope could grow if she gave it enough time and enough room. At sundown, Dorset made them all sit down on the split log step and eat beans and cornbread from tin plates, while the first cool air of the evening came down off the ridge. There were 7 of them now, 7 people sitting in a row on a step that had been occupied by one grieving woman 48 hours earlier, and the change was so enormous and so sudden that Rena could not quite take it in. Tal told a long, stammering story about a goat his uncle had once tried to teach to pull a cart. The goat, according to Tal, had learned to pull the cart, but had also learned to choose its own destinations, and had once pulled a full load of flour through the front door of the Methodist church during a Sunday service. The Mead brothers laughed in their quiet way, which meant that Weston pressed his lips together and looked at the ground, and Arlo shook his head slowly from side to side. Dorset said that she had once known a goat that could open gate latches, and that all goats were agents of chaos, sent to test the patience of mankind. Ottilie sat on the end of the step, with her ledger book on her lap, and made notes in the margins with the stub of pencil she kept behind her ear. Judd sat against the trunk of a dead pecan with his hat in his lap and said quietly that he had not felt this useful in a very long time. Rena listened to all of it and did not trust herself to speak. She had gone to sleep 2 nights ago as an abandoned woman. She was ending this day as something else, and she did not yet know what to call it. She was not yet a businesswoman. She was not yet a craftswoman. She was not yet the woman she would become. She was something in between, something fragile and new, like a sapling that has just broken the surface of the soil and has not yet decided how tall it wants to grow. She looked at the 6 people sitting on her step, eating beans from her plates, and she thought about the Dawes family and the words she had said to them and the words she had said to Judd, and the difference between the two, and she felt the stone in her chest shift slightly, not dissolving, not yet, but loosening its grip. Let me ask you something. 6 strangers. Not one of them owed her a thing, but they sat on her step and ate her beans and laughed about a goat and stayed. Have you ever had someone stay when they did not have to? Someone who showed up with bread or beans, or just their 2 hands and said, "I am here and I am not leaving"? I would love to know who that was for you. Tell me in the comments. And if you are still here, still listening, I am glad. Because this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. The banker arrived on a Wednesday, one day before the note came due, because waiting until Thursday would have meant letting someone else get there first. His name was Galt Haddon. He was 49 years old. He had a stiff collar and a black coat, and a tall black horse, and the face of a man who has learned to deliver bad news without flinching, which is a skill that certain professions require, and that most people mistake for cruelty. He was not cruel. He was careful. He was a man who believed in numbers and contracts, and the orderly transfer of property from those who could not pay to those who could. And he had ridden out to the Sable place one day early, because he had heard in town that Harlan Sable had abandoned his wife, and his land and his debt. And Galt Haddon wanted to see for himself what was left. What he saw when he dismounted at the edge of the grove confused him visibly. There were 6 people working among the fallen trees. 2 men were running a cross-cut saw through a massive pecan trunk. Another man was marking boards with a pencil and a square. A boy was driving a team of oxen through the rows, dragging cut logs toward a clearing where a woman in a gray dress was making notes in a ledger book. Another woman was carrying water from somewhere behind the cabin, and the young woman who was supposedly alone and desperate and ready to give up the land was standing in the middle of it all with sawdust in her hair and a hand plane in her grip, and the expression of a person who has not slept enough but has found a reason to stay awake. Ottilie saw him first. She closed her ledger and walked across the grove to meet him, and she walked with purpose and without hurry, the walk of a woman who has been preparing for this exact moment since she first saw a young girl standing in her store with dust on her boots. She was carrying the ledger in her left hand, and her right hand was free, and there was something about the way she held herself that made Galt Haddon take off his hat before she reached him, which he had not planned to do. "Mr. Haddon," Ottilie said, "good of you to ride out. Mrs. Sable will be paying the $412 today in full. I am her bookkeeper. Please step into the shade, and I will show you the accounts." Galt Haddon looked at the ledger. He looked at the stacks of sawn pecan lumber already drying on trestles that someone had built that morning from scrap. He looked at Judd Fennick, whom he knew by reputation as a man who could make a barrel so tight it would hold whiskey for 20 years without losing a drop. He looked at the Meade brothers, whom he knew by sight as the best timbermen in the county. He looked at all of this, and he recalculated. Ottilie opened the ledger and showed him the bridge loan she had drawn against her own store account at 4% interest. She showed him the figures. She showed him the projections. She showed him the list of potential buyers she had already contacted by letter, names in Austin and Brenham and Fredericksburg and San Antonio, men who had bought furniture and lumber from her store for years, and who would buy pecan wood of this quality without hesitation. Galt Haddon read the ledger. He read it carefully, with his lips slightly pursed, looking for the weakness. He did not find one. The numbers were clean. The projections were conservative. The bridge loan was properly documented. Ottilie Kask had been keeping books for longer than some of these trees had been alive, and her ledger was as tight as one of Judd Fennick's barrels. He signed the release. He accepted the bank draft. He put his hat back on and turned toward his horse. Then he stopped. He turned back to Ottilie and said quietly, so that only she could hear, "There is a man in San Antonio who has been asking about this parcel. His name is Leland Price. He deals in timber and land. I have not responded to his inquiry yet, but you should know he has made one." Then he mounted his horse and rode back to Brecker without looking back, and Rena, who had been watching from 30 feet away and had not heard what he said to Ottilie, saw something change in Ottilie's face. A tightening. A setting of the jaw. The face of a woman who has just learned that the fight she thought she was winning has a second front. Ottilie did not tell Rena about Leland Price that evening. She waited until the work was done and everyone had eaten and the grove was quiet and the stars were out and the air was cold enough to see your breath before she walked over to where Rena was sitting on the cabin step and sat down beside her and said, "There is something you need to know, and it is not going to make you happy." She told her about price. She told her what Haddon had said. She told her that a man who deals in timber and land and who asks about a 43-acre parcel of dead pecan trees is not a man who is looking to pay a fair price. He is a man who is looking for weakness. And right now, Ottilie said, we look weak. We look like a young woman with no husband and a group of strangers and a banknote that just barely got paid. We look like exactly the kind of situation a man like Leland Price knows how to use. Rena sat with that for a long time. The night was cool, and the stars were thick, and somewhere out in the dark, an owl was calling from the ridge, and the sound was lonely and beautiful, and completely indifferent to her problems. "How long do we have?" Rena asked. "I do not know," Ottilie said, "but not long. We need to make this grove produce faster than anyone thinks we can. We need to give Haddon a reason to keep Price at arm's length." Then they sat in silence for a while, two women on a step, and Rena felt something in her chest that was not the stone of guilt and was not the warmth of hope, but was something harder and sharper than either one. It was resolve. That night, after Ottilie had gone to bed, Rena lay awake and thought about Harlan. She did not think about him with anger. She thought about him with the kind of understanding that comes only when you have been hurt deeply enough to see the person who hurt you clearly, without the distortion of love or the distortion of rage. Harlan was not cruel. Harlan was not evil. Harlan was weak. He was a man who had looked at a dead grove and seen only death, and who had not been able to imagine that death could be the beginning of something instead of the end. He had run because running was the only response he knew to a problem he could not solve, and she felt sorry for him, genuinely sorry. And that was worse than anger, because anger at least has energy in it, and sorrow is just weight. She also thought about herself, about the woman she had been a year ago, standing in the yard telling Mr. Dawes she did not need his water. Pride and fear. Two sides of the same coin. Harlan had feared the dead grove and run from it. She had feared the neighbor's help and refused it. They were both running from something. The only difference was that she had stopped. The first hard blow came 8 days after the note on the door. The kind of blow that tests whether the thing you are building has roots or is just leaning against something. A second drought wind came through the hills in the night, hot and dry and steady, the kind of wind that comes off the western desert and pushes through the limestone gaps and does not stop until it reaches the eastern lowlands. Rena heard it start sometime after midnight. She heard it build. She heard it rise from a whisper to a moan to a howl, and she lay in her bed and listened to it and felt the cabin shudder and wondered what it was taking from her now. What it took was the tallest dead pecan at the south edge of the grove. The tree cracked at its base sometime in the darkest part of the night with a sound like a rifle shot, and it came down across the workshed that Judd and the Meade brothers had spent 4 days building. It crushed the roof. It flattened 2 drying trestles. It smashed a full stack of chair stock that Rena had spent 3 days planning by hand, board by board, until her shoulders ached and her palms were blistered through her gloves, and each board was smooth enough to pass Judd's inspection, which required running his fingertips along the surface with his eyes closed, and nodding once if it was good enough, and shaking his head if it was not. All of it was gone. 3 days of work. The roof, the trestles, the wood. Rena came out at sunrise and stood in front of the wreckage and felt the inside of her chest go cold. Not the cold of grief. She knew grief's cold from the morning of the note. This was something deeper and more dangerous. The cold of a person who has begun to believe in something and has just watched it get crushed. The cold of almost. The cold of we were so close. The cold that makes you want to sit down on the step again and stay there this time and never get up. She stood there for a long time. 5 minutes. Maybe more. The wind had died, and the morning was still, and the wreckage was sharp and clear in the early light, and it looked like the end of everything she had spent the last 8 days building. Then Judd came and stood beside her. He did not touch her. He did not say it was going to be all right because he was not a man who said things he did not know to be true. He looked at the fallen tree and the smashed shed and the ruined wood, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he spoke. We built the shed in the wrong place. We built it where the wind had a long, clear run at it, open ground all the way from the south ridge. That was my mistake. I should have seen it. We will rebuild it in the lee of that limestone outcrop on the north side, where the ridge blocks the wind. We will build it lower to the ground, and we will build it stronger, and we will build it out of the very tree that fell on it. That tree did us a favor, Rena. It showed us what we did not know. Rena took a long, slow breath. She looked at the fallen tree, and the splintered trestles, and the ruined chair stock, and she thought about how little she had started with. And she thought about how far away $412 had felt only 2 weeks ago. And she thought about how close it had felt yesterday. And she felt something happen inside herself that was quiet and permanent, like a bone setting. She felt herself step forward into the kind of woman she had sat across from in the dry goods store, the kind who does not run from a fallen tree, the kind who reads it as a lesson and gets back to work. She picked up her hand plane from the wreckage. The blade was still sharp. She said, "Where do we start?" That evening, after they had spent the day salvaging what they could from the fallen tree and clearing the wreckage, Judd and Rena sat on the limestone outcrop at the north end of the property and watched the last light fade from the ridge. The others had gone to rest. The grove was quiet except for the sound of the cooling wood, ticking and creaking as it settled. Judd was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Rena had not expected. "I had a shop once, in Gonzales. A real shop, not a shed in a dead grove. I made barrels for the distilleries. Good barrels. The best in the county. People came from as far as Houston to buy my barrels." He paused. He turned his hat in his hands. "I lost it. Not to a drought. Not to a storm. I lost it to whiskey. The same whiskey I was building the barrels to hold. I drank it, and I drank more of it, and I drank it until my wife left, and my shop closed, and I woke up one morning on the floor of my own cooperage with nothing left but the tools and the shakes." Rena looked at him. His face was calm. He was not asking for sympathy. He was stating facts the way he stated facts about wood, clearly and without decoration. That was 7 years ago. I have not had a drink since, but every time I smell wet oak, I remember the taste of bourbon. And every time I pick up a chisel, I remember what my hands did when they were not holding tools. I did not come to your grove because I am a good man, Rena. I came because I needed a reason for my hands to do good work, instead of reaching for a bottle. You are not the only one being saved here." They sat in silence after that. Two broken people on a limestone ridge, watching the stars come out over a dead grove, each one holding their own particular kind of damage, each one offering the other the only thing they had left to offer, which was the willingness to show up tomorrow and do it again. The new work shed went up in 5 days. Judd laid the foundation on field stones hauled from the creek bed. The Meade brothers framed it in a single afternoon with the salvaged pecan beams from the fallen tree. And the beams were harder and denser than any lumber they could have bought because they had been drying in the Texas sun for 15 months, and they were as strong as iron. Tal's oxen dragged the roof timbers into place one at a time, and Rena worked alongside them on every stage, sawing and planing and driving the pegs into the mortise joints that Judd had cut with a chisel and a wooden mallet. When the last peg went in, Judd put his hand on the new ridge beam and said quietly that it was stronger than the first one had ever been, and that the lesson had cost them a week and was worth a year. By the 9th day, after the note on the door, Rena had learned to use Judd's smaller lathe for bowls. She was turning out 4 a day that Ottilie pronounced worth 80 cents apiece, which was not a fortune but was not nothing either, and each one was a little better than the last, a little smoother, a little truer, a little more like the work of a woman who was learning to trust her own hands. Her hands had stopped blistering and had started hardening. Dorset brought her a cake of yellow soap made with lye and pecan oil, and said it was the only thing that would keep a woodworker's hands from cracking open in a Texas winter. Rena took it and thanked her, and Dorset said, "Do not thank me. Use it. Your hands are the most valuable thing on this property, and that includes the trees." Then Leland Price came to the door. He arrived on a fine chestnut horse 3 days after the shed had been rebuilt, exactly when Rena was most vulnerable, and exactly when a man like Leland Price would choose to arrive. He wore a black vest and a clean white shirt, and a hat that had cost more than everything Rena owned put together, and he dismounted with the ease of a man who is comfortable in every room he enters, because he has learned that comfort is a weapon. He was 55 years old. He had a lean face and gray eyes that were not unkind but were not warm either, the eyes of a man who has learned to see the world as a series of transactions. His hair was silver at the temples, and his mustache was trimmed close, and his boots were polished, and his hands were clean, which told Rena everything she needed to know about how long it had been since he had done his own work. He introduced himself. He told her he was in the timber business. He told her he had heard about her situation, and he was sorry about it. He told her he admired what she was doing out here with the grove, and he could see she had good people helping her. And then he told her he would like to buy the 43 acres for $200, cash, today. $200 was less than half the banknote she had just paid. It was an insult dressed in politeness, and Rena knew it, and Price knew she knew it. And he made the offer anyway, because that was how the game was played. You offer low. You wait for the desperation to do its work. You come back next week and offer a little more. And eventually, the person sells because they are tired and scared, and the number starts to look better than the alternative. "No," Rena said. Price did not seem surprised. He nodded slowly, and he looked at the grove, and he said, in a voice that was almost gentle, "You are young. You do not yet understand how fast land can swallow a person whole, how fast a good thing can turn when the money runs out and the help dries up, and you are standing here alone again in 6 months, with nothing but sawdust and debt." He paused, and then he said something that changed the way Rena looked at him. "I lost my wife and my daughter. Fever. Indianola. 11 years ago. The land I live on now is the land I bought after I buried them. I did not come here to rob you, Mrs. Sable. I came because I know what land does to a person who is alone on it. I know what it takes. I know what it costs. And I am offering you a way out before it costs you what it cost me." Rena looked at him for a long time. She saw the grief in his eyes, which was real. She saw the calculation behind the grief, which was also real. And she understood that Leland Price was not a villain. He was a man who had lost everything and had rebuilt himself around the only thing he had left, which was the ability to acquire. He had forgotten how to build without conquering. He had forgotten that there was a difference between owning land and belonging to it. "No," she said again. But she said it more quietly this time, and Price heard the difference, and he nodded, and he got on his horse and rode away. He did not leave the story. A week later, Ottilie heard through a contact at the bank that Price had approached Galt Haddon with an offer to purchase Rena's note. If Price bought the note, he would own the debt. And if he owned the debt, he could call it due whenever he chose. And if Rena could not pay, he would own the land. It was legal. It was clean. It was the kind of move that a man who has forgotten how to build makes when he wants what belongs to someone else. Haddon had not agreed yet. But he had not refused either. He had given Price 3 weeks to formalize the offer, which meant that Rena had 3 weeks to prove the grove was profitable enough to make Haddon's decision easy. 3 weeks to fill orders and collect payments and build a record that would make any banker choose a steady account over a speculator's cash. 3 weeks. The clock was ticking. By the end of the second week after the note, they had 50 chairbacks, 24 table legs, and a growing stack of turned bowls drying on the new trestles, and Ottilie had filled 4 pages of her ledger, with orders from Austin, Brenham, and Fredericksburg. The wood was moving. The money was starting to come in. The grove was coming back to life, not as an orchard, but as something new, something that had no name yet, but was taking shape under their hands. I know this is getting tense. I know some of you are sitting there right now thinking about Price and feeling something complicated, because he is not a monster. He is a man who lost his family and turned his grief into a machine for acquiring things. And some of you know exactly what that looks like because you have seen it in someone you loved, or someone you worked for, or maybe in the mirror. That is the thing about this story. Nobody in it is simple. So let me ask you this. Have you ever met a Leland Price? Someone who was not cruel, but who had forgotten how to be kind. Someone who was so busy surviving that they forgot how to live? Tell me in the comments, and stay with me, because what happens next is going to surprise you. By the end of October, word of the sable Pecan furniture had traveled as far as San Antonio. Ottilie Kask had written 37 letters in 2 weeks, each one in her careful slanting hand on store letterhead, each one describing the quality of the wood and the skill of the craftsman and the particular beauty of dry-standing pecan that has been seasoned by the Texas sun. She had sent samples with the mail riders, small turned bowls and spindle sections, and thin boards planed smooth enough to show the figure in the grain. And the samples had done what samples do when the product is genuine. They had sold themselves. A buyer from a hotel in Galveston rode up to the grove in the first week of November and spent an hour walking among the drying stacks of lumber with Judd, running his hands over the boards, holding them up to the light, tapping them with his knuckles. His name was Creighton Hale, and he had been buying furniture for hotels and restaurants along the Gulf Coast for 20 years. And he said plainly that he had never handled pecan wood of this quality. He ordered 30 dining chairs on the spot. The order came to $640. Ottilie wrote it up in her ledger with a hand that Rena saw was trembling slightly. Not shaking, trembling. The way a hand trembles when the body it is attached to is feeling something so large and so long-awaited that it cannot hold it all inside. Rena asked her why. Ottilie closed the ledger and pressed both palms flat on the cover and looked at Rena and said, "I have waited 16 years to see a young woman walk into my store with a note in her hand and walk back out with a future. And now I have seen it. And I am going to allow myself to tremble about it if I choose to." Dorset had opened a small kitchen in the new work shed. She had hauled a cast-iron wood stove up on her own buckboard, a stove that weighed more than she did, and that she had loaded by herself using a plank ramp and language that she later described as persuasive. She fed everyone from that stove, breakfast and dinner, and sometimes a late supper when the work ran long, and her biscuits became famous among the workers and then among the buyers who started riding up the road from Brecker to see the grove for themselves. Tal drove teams of oxen through the hills hauling finished furniture down to Brecker for shipping. The Mead brothers worked the saws from sunup to sundown, and their arms grew hard and their hands grew calloused, and they stopped going home on Sundays because there was too much work to do and because the grove had become something none of them wanted to leave. Judd sat in the center of it all at his turning lathe, and he made each chair spindle by hand, one at a time, feeling the wood with his fingertips as it spun, shaping it by touch as much as by sight. And each spindle was as true and smooth as a thing made by a machine. Except that it was not made by a machine. It was made by a man who had lost everything to a bottle and had found this instead. But Price was not finished. When he could not buy the land and could not buy the debt, he changed his approach. He went to Louisiana and bought a shipment of cheap pecan lumber, green wood that had not been properly dried, and he hired a crew of carpenters in San Antonio to build furniture from it, simple chairs and tables that looked passable at a distance but would warp and crack within a year. He shipped this furniture to Fredericksburg and Austin and sold it at half the price Rena was charging, and he put a name on it that was close enough to cause confusion. Price Country Pecan. Not sable, but close enough to steal a glance. The first Rena heard of it was when a buyer in Austin wrote to cancel an order, saying he had found pecan furniture at a better price and saw no reason to pay more for what looked like the same thing. Ottilie read the letter aloud at the supper table, and the room went quiet. Judd set down his fork and was still for a moment, and then he said, "Green wood." "What?" Rena said. "The furniture Price is selling is made from green wood," Judd said. "I would bet my lathe on it. Pecan that has not been dried will look fine for 6 months, and then it will twist and split, and the joints will open up, and the whole piece will fall apart like a lie that has run out of time. He is selling furniture with a disease built into it. The wood does not know it yet. But it will." "That does not help us now," Rena said. "People are buying his chairs instead of ours." Judd stood up from the table and walked to the lathe. He picked up a piece of pecan heartwood, a piece with the deep swirling figure that only dry standing wood produces, the kind of grain that looks like water moving under ice, and he held it up in the lamplight and turned it slowly. "Then we make something his wood cannot make," he said. "We make one piece so beautiful that anyone who sees it will know the difference between what he is selling and what we are building. We make a chair that answers every question before it is asked." He worked on that chair for 6 days. He would not let anyone help him except Rena, who turned the spindles on the small lathe, while Judd shaped the back and the seat and the legs on the large one. He used the best wood in the shed, a piece of heartwood from the oldest tree in the grove, the one with the deepest figure, the one that had been standing longest in the sun. The finished chair was simple. It was a dining chair. It had 4 legs and a straight back with 3 spindles and a shaped seat, and it looked like 100 other chairs, except that it did not look like any other chair in the world. The wood glowed. The grain swirled and shifted in the light like something alive. The joints were so tight that you could not slide a thread between them. The seat was curved to fit a body, and the back was angled to support a spine, and the whole thing weighed 7 pounds, and was strong enough to hold 3 men stacked on top of each other. It was the most beautiful piece of furniture Rena had ever seen. It was the most beautiful piece of furniture Judd had ever made, and they both knew it. Ottilie took the chair to the trade fair in Fredericksburg. She set it in the middle of her booth, with a small hand-lettered sign beside it that said, "Ask me about the tree that died so this chair could live." People stopped. People looked. People sat in the chair and ran their hands along the armrests and felt the grain under their fingers, and asked questions that Ottilie answered with the patience and precision of a woman who had been rehearsing this conversation in her head for 30 years without knowing it. She told them about the grove. She told them about the drought. She told them about dry-standing pecan, and why it was different from green wood, and why the difference mattered. She told them about a young woman who had been left alone with dead trees and had turned them into something worth sitting in. Orders doubled in a single afternoon. Buyers from San Antonio and Houston and Dallas wrote their names in Ottilie's ledger. A furniture dealer from New Orleans placed an order for 20 chairs and 10 tables and asked to see the grove himself. Price came to the fair. Rena was not there to see it, but Ottilie told her about it afterward, and she told it without embellishment because Ottilie was not a woman who embellished. Price walked into the booth and looked at the chair. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Then he reached out and touched the grain, the swirling figure in the heartwood, and his hand stayed on the wood for longer than a man's hand stays on something he is only evaluating. He was not evaluating. He was remembering. Ottilie saw something cross his face that she had not expected to see. Not anger, not calculation. Something older and softer and more painful than either one. Something that had been locked away for 11 years and had just been unlocked by the feel of figured pecan wood under his palm. He left the booth without speaking. He found Rena 2 days later. He rode out to the grove in the late afternoon, and he dismounted, and he stood at the edge of the property, and he looked at everything she had built, the work shed, and the drying stacks, and the lathe, and the people working among the trees, and his face was calm and empty, and very tired. He said, "You keep the land. I will tell Haddon to withdraw my offer." Rena looked at him. He did not look like a man who had lost a fight. He looked like a man who had remembered something he had been trying to forget for a very long time. She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The chair." And then he paused and said, "My wife had a table. Pecan. Her father made it. She used to sit at that table every evening and put her hand flat on the surface and say she could feel her father's hands in the grain. I sold that table after she died because I could not stand to look at it. That was the worst decision I ever made. Worse than any offer I have made to you. Worse than anything." He got on his horse. He looked at the grove one more time. And then he said, without looking at Rena, "You are building something I forgot how to build. I am going to leave it alone." He rode south toward San Antonio. Rena watched him go, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was sadness. Not for herself. For him. For a man who had sold his wife's table and would spend the rest of his life knowing it. For a man who knew how to acquire but had forgotten how to keep. For a man who only knew how to leave, and who knew he was leaving, and who did it anyway because he had forgotten there was any other choice. I want to stop here for just one moment. Because that chair did something that no argument could have done. It did not prove Price wrong. It did not defeat him. It reminded him of who he used to be. And sometimes a beautiful thing, a simple, beautiful thing made by careful hands, can reach a place inside a person that words cannot find. Do you have something like that? An object, a smell, a song, a texture under your fingers that takes you back to a time before you built all your walls? I think we all do. Tell me about yours. I am listening. A week after Price rode south, Galt Haddon came to the grove for the second time. He did not dismount. He sat on his tall black horse at the edge of the property and looked at the work shed and the drying stacks and the wagons being loaded for Galveston, and he said, from the saddle, that Mr. Price had formally withdrawn his offer, and that the bank considered the Sable account in good standing. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse back toward Brecker. And that was the last time anyone worried about losing the land. By Christmas of 1891, the bank note had been paid 3 times over, just as Judd had said it would be. Rena opened her own account at the bank in Brecker, in her own name, and when she walked in the door, Galt Haddon stood up from his desk and took off his hat, and did not put it back on until she had sat down. Dorset's kitchen in the workshed had become a gathering place. Buyers rode up the road from Brecker and from further away, from Fredericksburg and Austin and San Antonio, and Dorset fed them all, biscuits and beans and salt pork and coffee, and pecan pie made with nuts from the old trees, the last nuts they had borne before the drought, which Rena had found in a burlap sack in the back of the cabin, and had been saving without knowing what she was saving them for. The Galveston order alone came to $640. Ottilie wrote it up in her ledger, and closed the book, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover, and her eyes closed, and Rena saw her lips move silently, and did not ask what she was saying because some prayers are private. On Christmas Eve, after the last worker had gone home, and the grove was quiet, and the stars were out, and the air was cold enough to see your breath in the lamplight, Ottilia and Rena sat in the cabin by the stove, and Ottilie told her the truth. She told it simply, without decoration and without apology. "My husband did not die of fever," Ottilie said. "That is what I have told this town for 16 years, and it is a lie. My husband left, the same way yours did. He went out one morning before dawn, and he took the good horse, and he did not come back. He did not leave a note. He did not have the courtesy to leave a note. I found out he was gone when I woke up, and the horse was gone, and his boots were gone, and the tin where we kept our money was empty." She paused. She looked at the stove. The fire was low and orange, and the light of it moved across her face. "I told people he had died because I could not bear to say what really happened. A widow gets sympathy. An abandoned wife gets pity, and pity and sympathy are not the same thing. Sympathy says, 'I understand.' Pity says, 'I am glad I am not you.' I chose sympathy because it was easier to live inside. I built the store by myself. I raised 2 children by myself. I learned to keep books and order stock, and negotiate with wholesalers, and collect debts, and do every single thing that people in this town assumed my husband had taught me to do before he died. And every night for 16 years, I have set 2 cups of coffee on the table before I remembered I only need 1. That is the kind of habit grief makes. It does not go away. It just becomes furniture in the room you live in." Rena listened without interrupting. She did not say she was sorry, because she understood that Ottilie was not looking for sorrow. Ottilie was looking for something else. She was looking for the relief that comes from finally telling the truth to someone who will not look at her differently afterward. "I helped you because I recognized you," Ottilie said. "I looked at you standing in my store with that note in your hand, and I saw myself 16 years ago, except that I did not have an Ottilie. I did not have anyone. I had to figure it all out alone, and it nearly killed me. Not the work. The alone. The alone is what nearly killed me. So when I saw you, I decided that you were not going to be alone. That is all. That is the whole reason." Rena reached across the space between them and took Ottilia's hand. She held it. She did not say anything. She held it the way you hold something precious that has been carried too long by one pair of hands. They sat like that for a long time. 2 women in a cabin, one who had been abandoned 10 weeks ago, and one who had been abandoned 16 years ago. And between them was not just comfort, but recognition. The deep, specific recognition of two people who have survived the same wound and have found each other on the other side of it. That was the real gift. Not the business, not the money, not the chairs or the bowls or the lumber. The real gift was this: the knowledge that you are not the only one. The knowledge that someone else has stood in the room you are standing in and walked out of it and lived. The knowledge that survival is not a solo act, no matter what the world tells you, no matter what your pride tells you, no matter what you told the Dawes family when they offered you their water. In the spring of 1892, a letter arrived from a rail camp in New Mexico. It was from Harlan. It said only that he was sorry and that he was not coming home, and that the deed to the 43 acres was hers, free and clear. Rena read the letter once. She folded it along its crease. She put it in the tin box under the bed, the same tin that had once held everything she owned in the world. Her eyes stayed dry. Whatever tears she had owned, she had spent them all on an October morning a long time ago, and she had none left for this, and did not need any. She walked out to the grove after reading it. The workshed was busy. The Meade brothers were sawing. Tal was loading a wagon. Dorset was in the kitchen. Ottilie was at her ledger. Judd was at his lathe. And the sound of the lathe was the sound of a man making something beautiful out of something that had been left for dead, which was the sound of the whole operation, which was the sound of her life now. She stood at the edge of the grove and looked at the stumps of the trees they had already felled, and the standing trunks of the trees they had not yet reached, and the workshed, and the drying stacks, and the people. Her people. The strangers who had become a family in the span of a single autumn, and she felt the stone in her chest finally dissolve. Not all at once, not with drama or ceremony. It dissolved the way a thing dissolves when you stop holding on to it, slowly and quietly, until one morning you reach for it, and it is simply not there anymore. She planted 200 new pecan trees along the creek that spring. She planted them where the drought had never quite reached, in the low ground near the water, in the rich, dark soil that the creek had been building for 1,000 years. She dug each planting hole herself with a spade that Judd had forged a new handle for, a handle made from pecan heartwood left over from the first year's work. She carried each young sapling down from the nursery she had set up on the limestone ridge, a nursery she had built by grafting cuttings from the strongest of the old dead trees onto rootstock she had ordered from a grower in San Marcos. She watered every tree through its first summer, with buckets hauled up from the creek on a yoke that Tal had carved for her out of a piece of dry pecan heartwood, a yoke shaped to fit her shoulders and polished smooth with beeswax and pecan oil. Every single tree. 200 holes, 200 saplings, 200 trips up the hill from the creek, with a wooden yoke on her shoulders in the Texas heat. She did it because the grove was not just a business, it was a living thing, and living things need to be renewed, and renewal is not something you can delegate or postpone or pay someone else to do for you. Renewal is personal. Renewal is the act of putting your hands in the dirt and saying, I am still here. I am still building. I am not finished yet. The Sable Pecan Grove workshop ran for 31 years. Judd taught his craft to Rena and to Tal, and eventually to 2 of Tal's sons. And the workshop grew from a shed in a dead grove to a proper building with a shingled roof and glass windows, and 3 lathes, and a showroom where buyers could sit in the chairs they were about to purchase and feel the grain under their hands. By the turn of the century, the shop employed 14 people and shipped furniture as far as St. Louis and New Orleans. The dead pecans were all used up by 1897. Every tree, every trunk, every branch thick enough to turn or split or plane. They used it all, and each piece became something, a chair or a table or a bowl or a spindle or a box or a handle. And each thing made from those dead trees carried inside it the memory of the drought that killed them and the woman who refused to let their death be the end of the story. The years passed the way years pass when a life has found its shape. Not without difficulty, not without loss, but with the steady forward motion of a thing that has deep roots and knows where it belongs. Rena married Judd's youngest nephew, a gentle bookbinder from Brenham named Emery Fenwick, in the spring of 1894. The ceremony was held in the workshed, under the oak beam she had helped raise, the beam that had replaced the one the falling tree had destroyed. Ottilie stood beside her, and Dorset cooked the wedding supper, and Tal drove the wedding wagon, and the Meade brothers stood in the back row and pressed their lips together and shook their heads slowly from side to side, which was their way of being deeply and unexpectedly moved. They raised 3 daughters in the cabin, where the note had once been pinned to the door. The door itself was replaced in 1896, and Rena kept the old door in the workshed, leaning against the wall behind Judd's lathe, not as a reminder of pain, but as a measure of distance. She wanted her daughters to see that door. She wanted them to know where she had started, so they would understand how far she had come. Ottilie Cask lived to be 79. She was buried in the Brecker Cemetery, and at the head of her grave, Judd placed a pecan chair he had made for her, the finest chair he ever made. With grain so figured, it looked like rivers seen from a great height. The chair stood at her grave for 20 years before the weather finally took it, and during those 20 years, people who visited the cemetery would sometimes sit in it, which Ottilie would have liked. She was a woman who believed that furniture should be used, not admired. She was a woman who believed that everything of value should be put to work. Some departures leave a hole. Judd Fenwick left a workshop full of people who could hear his voice in every piece of wood they touched. He lived to 83. He turned his last bowl 2 weeks before he died. A small, simple bowl made from a scrap of Pecan heartwood that he had saved from the first year's work, a piece from the tree at the center of the grove, the one he had pressed his palm against on the morning everything began. He gave the bowl to Rena, and she kept it on the table in the cabin for the rest of her life. And when her daughters asked about it, she would pick it up and turn it in her hands and say that it was made by a man who had lost everything and found it again in a dead grove in Texas, and that the bowl was proof that the finding was real. Dorset Anwell's kitchen in the workshed became a proper boarding house by 1895. She fed every traveling buyer who came up the road to place an order, and every worker who came looking for employment, and every stranger who wandered in off the road looking hungry, and she never charged any of them a cent more than they could afford, and she never turned anyone away. When people asked her why, she would look at them with her sharp cheekbones and her weathered face and say, "Because I heard there was a hungry person on the road." And I do not like that sentence. Tal outgrew his stammer by the time he was 25. His voice found its steadiness the same way the rest of him had found his, through years of careful work and the quiet confidence that comes from being trusted with heavy things. He married one of Rena's daughters in a ceremony held under the new pecan trees along the creek, the trees that Rena had planted with her own hands, and the trees were tall enough by then to give shade, which meant they were tall enough to hold a wedding and a life and a future that had once seemed impossible. What the people of Brecker and Llano County never quite understood was how a young woman with $14 and a note on a door had looked at a grove of dead trees and seen a workshop. The answer, which Rena told only to her 3 daughters late in her life, was that she had not seen it at all. She had not seen anything except dead wood and dust, and the end of everything she had planned. A quiet man by a nail barrel had seen it, and a broad woman in a dove-gray dress had known that man was standing there. And Rena had only had the good sense to say yes when two people who owed her nothing offered her the one thing she had no other way to find. That was the hardest part, Rena told her daughters. Not the work, not the drought, not the fallen tree or the banker, or the man from San Antonio. The hardest part was saying yes. The hardest part was letting someone help me. Because I had spent my whole life believing that needing help meant I was weak, and I had to learn that it meant I was human, and that lesson cost me everything I had except the one thing that mattered, which was the willingness to learn it. Dry limbs are not the end of anything, Rena would tell her daughters, and her daughters would tell their daughters, and the words would carry forward the way all true things carry forward. Not because someone wrote them down, but because someone lived them. Dry limbs are only wood that has already done its waiting. And now this story is done. But before I let you go, I want to say one thing to you. Wherever you are, whatever chair you are sitting in, whatever room you are listening from, you might be holding a note right now. Not a note on a door, maybe, but the other kind. The kind that life writes when it takes something from you and does not explain why. A marriage, a job, a home, a person you loved, your health, your confidence, the future you thought you had. If you are holding that note, I want you to hear what Ottilie said to Rena in the dry goods store on that October afternoon. A dead grove is not the same thing as a dead woman. Those trees are still standing. And standing wood is worth more than you think. You are still standing. And you are worth more than you think. And somewhere near you, right now, there is a person who can see what you cannot see yet. And all you have to do is turn around and say the hardest, simplest, most important word you will ever learn. Yes, thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story meant something to you, share it with a woman in your life who needs to hear it. And I will see you in the next one.